Not everyone understands this. These words of Bruce Lee will profoundly affect you. The room was silent before he arrived. Not a whisper, not a stir. Yet everyone felt the weight of expectation. In less than a minute, a man more than twice his size would leave the space stunned. Not from brute force, but from something far quieter. By the time the witnesses recovered their breath, the outcome was already clear. Mastery had spoken, and it had spoken without a single word. The room was modest, more gym than hall, with walls lined in faded wood and mirrors reflecting the gathering crowd. The air carried the faint scent of sweat, chalk, and worn leather, a quiet testament to countless hours of training. It was not a place built for spectacle, yet today it seemed to hum with expectation. On the edges of the space, spectators leaned forward slightly, not in excitement, but in careful observation. They were not here for a fight in the usual sense. They had come because the whispers had reached them. A man had arrived whose reputation was neither shouted nor sold, yet it carried weight like gravity. The whispers carried stories, some from those who had trained with him, others from those who had merely glimpsed him in passing. Each story hinted at a precision, a calm authority, a mastery that unsettled without effort. The challenger entered soon after, larger, imposing, and confident in the strength he carried in his frame. He surveyed the room with a smile meant to settle nerves, his own and everyone else's. But the room's attention remained drawn elsewhere. Not to size, not to boldness, but to the quiet figure already standing at the center. He did not move. He did not call attention to himself. Yet there was a rhythm to the way he held his posture, subtle, almost imperceptible. His eyes scanned the space once, then settled. They did not dart or glare. They simply observed. And in that observation, the room felt the first stirrings of inevitability. Something about the way he occupied the space suggested that what was about to unfold had already begun. Witnesses would later recall the odd stillness. It was not the absence of action, it was the presence of control. Every breath, every slight shift of weight, every minute gesture contained a quiet authority. The room itself seemed to defer, leaning in, not in anticipation of violence, but in acknowledgement of order. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the air seemed measured. The larger man, confident in his size and history of dominance, adjusted his stance, yet in that adjustment, there was a subtle shift. He was measuring, comparing, unaware that the comparison had already decided its own conclusion. In that room, the difference between presence and display became clear. One man carried presence. The other carried display. The crowd felt it in their own bodies. Attention, not loud, but insistent. It pressed against the skin, nestled behind the eyes, and whispered that what would follow could not be hurried, could not be forced, could only be witnessed. And so, the arena of eyes remained silent. It was here, in this quiet, in this measured pause, that the first lesson of mastery was delivered. Not through words, not through striking, but through the deliberate, controlled occupation of space. A presence that demanded acknowledgement, not through fear, but through recognition of inevitability. The room waited, not for action, not for spectacle, but for the demonstration of authority in its most subtle form. A demonstration that would unfold without haste, without noise, and leave its mark in the memory of all who watched. The larger man moved into the center with a certainty that demanded attention. He carried the confidence of size, of reputation, of past victories, yet it was precise and deliberate, not brash. Every step was measured, a quiet assertion that he had done this before, and he could do it again. He looked around, eyes scanning faces, searching for acknowledgement. Some gave it, some withheld it, unsure if he belonged at the center of this particular moment. His gaze eventually settled on the smaller figure who had already made the room pause. The contrast was immediate. One man projected force. The other projected calm. One sought recognition, the other required none. Observers would later recall how the challenger's presence was a kind of gravitational pull. The floorboards seemed to respond to his weight, the mirrors reflecting a frame that promised power. And yet, there was a subtle tension that grew as he closed the distance. Each movement was noticed, each shift registered. The room, already attuned to quiet authority, began to measure him against it. The master did not move forward. He did not meet the gaze directly. He waited. A slight adjustment of his stance, almost imperceptible, signaled awareness without urgency. His presence alone became a mirror, reflecting the challenger's energy back at him, forcing him to account for it. There was a subtle negotiation in that space, invisible to anyone who had not observed closely. Every inch of distance, every fraction of weight transferred from one foot to the other, became a dialogue. Not of words, not of boasts, not of threats, but of control. The larger man tested, probing for weakness. He flexed, shifted, even exhaled in a way that suggested dominance. Yet the master remained unshaken, silent, measured. Around them, the spectators leaned forward imperceptibly. They noticed the micromovements, a tilt of the head, a tightening of the shoulders, a slight rebalancing of stance. It was not action, but prelude. They were watching a confrontation that had already begun in the mind, before any hand was raised, before any technique was applied. And here, in this careful approach, the lesson deepened. Strength alone had its limitations. Confidence alone could be deceptive. True authority, as the master demonstrated, existed in patience, in observation, in control that did not need to assert itself violently. It was a presence that invited error rather than provoked resistance. The challenger paused. A bead of sweat traced the line of his temple, unnoticed by him, but registered by those trained to see. The crowd noticed it too, though they did not understand its significance yet. In the quiet, the balance of power had already shifted. The larger man stood in the center, expecting to dominate. But the arena, silent and observant, had begun to recognize the subtle command of the smaller figure, the man who did not move until it was necessary. The approach ended not with a clash, but with an unspoken acknowledgement. Two men faced each other, the room holding its collective breath. One brought size, history, and intent. The other brought quiet mastery, patience, and inevitability. And in that stillness, the first psychological edge was claimed. The room remained silent, though the silence was no longer neutral. It had weight. Every spectator felt it, some with anticipation, some with unease. Eyes shifted constantly between the two men, but no one dared break the pause. Conversation had ceased entirely. The crowd itself had become part of the demonstration, a living witness to the unfolding dynamic. Whispers began to circulate, quiet enough not to disturb the stillness, but audible to those who leaned in. Stories of the master's previous encounters were recalled in hushed tones. Some recounted brief glimpses of his skill, others long hours spent observing his technique. None described spectacle or noise, all described control. And yet, the larger man's reputation pressed against these whispers, creating a tension that was almost physical. Small gestures now carried immense significance. The master adjusted the alignment of his shoulders, shifted his weight fractionally, and the air seemed to respond. The larger man mirrored him unconsciously, as if drawn into the rhythm that he had neither invited nor understood. Each observer noted these subtleties. The alignment of the feet, the calmness in the hands, the measured exhalation that betrayed nothing but presence. It was a waiting game, but not one of impatience. The crowd itself became a mirror, reflecting the psychological tension that had taken root. Murmurs were replaced by focused observation. Every twitch, every micro-movement was recorded in memory. Those who had expected action found themselves reconsidering what victory might actually look like. In this atmosphere, the challenger began to show cracks. Not in a dramatic, visible collapse, but in hesitation. A pause longer than necessary, a blink too deliberate, a shift that suggested doubt. The master did not act. He maintained his posture, his quiet equilibrium. His stillness became a canvas upon which the larger man's uncertainty painted itself, subtly, almost invisibly. Time stretched. Seconds became moments. Moments became lessons. The crowd sensed it. The energy that had arrived with the larger man now began to dissipate into tension and quiet observation. They could not yet see the method, but they could feel the inevitability. And in this waiting, the first real demonstration of psychological dominance had occurred. No technique had been applied. No motion had yet decided the outcome. Yet the imbalance was clear. The master did not need to strike. He did not need to move. Authority, patience, and quiet observation had begun to dictate the narrative. The room itself bore witness. Presence, not action, was already shaping the outcome. When the confrontation began, it was not a clash of force. It was a dialogue of intent, spoken in movements so minimal they might have gone unnoticed to an untrained eye. The master did not strike quickly, nor did he posture for effect. Every adjustment he made was deliberate, calculated, and economical. The larger man moved first, testing, probing, seeking the limits of resistance. His gestures were broad, deliberate, meant to assert dominance. But the master met them with precision. A shift of the foot, a subtle pivot of the torso, a quiet alignment of weight, all executed without tension, without flourish, without noise. Each motion absorbed the challenger's energy rather than opposing it directly. Witnesses later described it as watching a river redirect a stone. The stone struck with force, but the current guided it, removed its impact, and rendered it ineffective. There was no struggle, no show of power, only the calm, meticulous application of skill that had been refined over years. In this space, mastery revealed itself in restraint. The master did not overwhelm. He contained. He redirected. Every movement was a question the challenger could not answer, a pattern he could not break. With each failed attempt to assert control, the larger man's confidence eroded, silently, almost imperceptibly. The room, once charged with anticipation, seemed to breathe along with the master's rhythm. Each observer understood, without words, that what they were witnessing was not a test of brute strength, but of awareness, timing, and deliberate efficiency. The master's calm became contagious. The challenger's agitation became evident in micro-expressions. A tightened jaw, a subtle shift backward, a hand lifted slightly higher than necessary. It was over before it truly began. The larger man's energy had already been expended in proving dominance that did not exist. The master's motions, minimal as they were, had conveyed authority far beyond size or history. By the end, the room recognized the quiet inevitability of the outcome. Mastery had asserted itself without a single forceful strike. And yet, there was no celebration, no triumph. The master's stance remained measured, controlled, silent. The demonstration concluded not with drama, but with a stillness that emphasized the lesson. Authority does not need to announce itself. It simply exists and the world acknowledges it. The larger man had entered the room with confidence, with certainty in his size and history, yet by now a subtle shift had taken root. It was not visible in dramatic gestures, nor in overt defeat, but in the quiet hesitation that began to color his movements. Each step he took seemed measured, uncertain, as though the air itself reminded him of limits he had never encountered. Witnesses later described the change as almost imperceptible at first. A slight falter in stance, a delayed response to a simple adjustment by the master. His breathing, once steady and assured, now carried a faint irregularity, a subtle echo of doubt. There was no shame in this room, yet the power dynamic had been quietly, irrevocably reversed. The master remained still, his control unbroken. He did not advance. He did not taunt. He simply existed within the moment, every movement precise, every gesture economical, every breath measured. This quiet dominance forced the larger man to confront his own assumptions. His confidence, his reliance on size and history, no longer provided certainty. It had been quietly dismantled. Around them, the crowd noticed. They could see the challenge eroding before their eyes, not through force, not through spectacle, but through the ineffable authority of someone who had refined presence into its most precise form. The larger man's gaze, which had once swept the room with dominance, now flickered with uncertainty. The unspoken acknowledgement of authority had begun to weigh. It was in these micro-moments that the true lesson was revealed. The challenger had relied on external measures, strength, reputation, size, to define control. The master relied on internal measures, observation, timing, restraint, presence. The larger man's collapse was not a dramatic fall, but a quiet concession. The understanding that mastery cannot be opposed with force alone. By the end, the room had shifted. The energy of confidence that had accompanied the challenger upon entry had dissipated. It was replaced by respect, yes, but more significantly by recognition of a principle older than any fight. Authority, when grounded in mastery, does not need to announce itself. It quietly asserts its inevitability. The master adjusted his stance one final time, small, almost imperceptible. The larger man, aware of the subtle command, retreated slightly, acknowledging without words the outcome. No applause followed. No dramatic gestures. Only the quiet understanding that the demonstration had concluded, and that its impact would endure long after the room emptied. Years later, the story lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The gym, once ordinary, had become a quiet landmark for those seeking understanding beyond spectacle. It was remembered not for a fight won, not for a display of strength, but for the subtle demonstration of mastery that had unfolded in stillness. Observers spoke in measured tones, recalling details that others might have dismissed. The alignment of a shoulder, the distribution of weight across the feet, the deliberate economy of motion that had shaped the entire confrontation. Each memory emphasized restraint over display, observation over impulse, presence over assertion. The larger man, too, carried the memory, not as shame but as a lesson quietly absorbed. He would recount the incident in later years, not with regret, not with anger, but with recognition of something he could not confront with muscle alone. Authority, as he had learned, was not a contest of size. It was the invisible force of quiet mastery, impossible to resist yet delivered without aggression. The spectators went on with their lives, yet the memory shaped their understanding of power. Many would later train in gyms, study martial arts, or navigate their own challenges, carrying with them the silent principle they had witnessed. True mastery does not announce itself. It waits. It observes. It acts only when necessary. Its lessons unfold gradually, shaping understanding long after the moment has passed. And in the quiet retelling of that day, the master's presence endured, not as legend born of spectacle, but as legend born of inevitability. Each pause, each measured breath, each deliberate movement became a reference point, a quiet testament to what can be achieved when skill, restraint, and awareness converge. Time did not erode the lesson. It crystallized it. The event became a benchmark, a story told in calm reflection rather than celebration. Those who spoke of it did so in hushed tones, mindful of its subtleties, aware that the most profound demonstrations of authority often leave no immediate impression, yet linger indefinitely. And so, long after the crowd had left, the weight of that day remained. Not as a tale of victory or defeat, but as a quiet affirmation. Mastery, when exercised with patience, restraint, and awareness, leaves its mark not on the body, but on perception, on memory, on the mind itself. The room may have emptied, the participants may have moved on, but the lesson endured. It endured in silence,